Hey everyone, welcome to the third ever episode of the JMMA Monday audio podcast. I'm your host, Jack Wannon. We have a very busy episode ahead of us this week because we are just hours removed from RIZIN 37. This was their return to the Saitama Super Arena. It included the beginning of a Super Atomweight Grand Prix, and overall it was 14 fights, so there's a lot to unpack here. We have a lot of returning names, we have this tournament to discuss, and we also have some little news stories to touch on at the end. I am solo this week. Past 2 weeks you saw a guest. There will be a guest back next week. But I just thought, I had to get this out Monday. That's just a day after RIZIN. It would be hard to schedule a guest and all that. So I just thought it would be better if I did it by myself and quickly run through some points about this show. And, we'll have a guest on next week and we'll talk about the show a little more then. But tonight it's just me. I'm doing it very much like the Combat Chronicles podcast by Kyle. I recommend people listen to that. I'm very much listening to him and taking notes and studying that style so I can hopefully put on a good episode here for you guys. So the big headline coming out of this event was obviously the Super Atomweight Grand Prix. It started back up, or it started. This is the second ever tournament they've done in the weight class. Notably, they did one back in 2017, and that was the star-making moment for Kana Asakura. But they had the opening round for it this weekend, and it had lots of big names in it. I've said before on this podcast I thought this was the perfect time to do this tournament just because there's so many names, some on their way out, some on their way in, and it was just a really good moment in time to do this tournament. So heading into this event, there was 4 fights, and the 4 big names in this bracket were all facing other people that were coming into the promotion, or at least didn't have as much of a experience in the promotion. Those 4 names were Reina, Kana Asakura, Ayaka Hamasaki, and current champion Seika Izawa. So we're going to start with Seika. She was in the main event of this card. She was facing promotional newcomer Laura Fontoura, and she had the most notable performance out of the 4 people who won this weekend. And that's mostly because she was the only one out of those 4 that scored a finish. She was able to submit Laura in the first round with a front choke. It was a very impressive performance from her, and it was a real statement because, this tournament, if successful for Izawa, is the real star-making moment for her. She's already champion. She's already beat Hamasaki, but getting 3 wins in this bracket will be a big deal if she can get those. And, this opening round was an interesting one because there were so many people in the tournament in this opening round who we haven't really seen anything of. And her opponent, Laura Fontoura, was definitely one of those people. We knew she had an undefeated record of 7 wins. We knew that she beat a former RIZIN fighter in Andy Nguyen. But we didn't really know anything about her, and there wasn't much out there on her. So we didn't know how good or how bad she was compared to someone like Izawa. So it was really big, in my opinion, to see Izawa go out there and get a finish because it just cemented her status right now as the top name in the division. And I just think the optics of her getting that finish when all the other people in the opening round of the bracket didn't get a finish really, elevates her to this status that she is the top dog in this tournament. I mean, we knew that going in, but I think this was just another example of that. So she really put on one of the better performances of the night. And, comparing performances on this card, we'll get to that in a moment, because this was kind of an interesting, weird card when we talk about the entertainment value of it. We'll definitely talk about that later on the podcast. But Izawa had the biggest performance of the bracket. If there was a bigger performance, not because of the finish, but because of the importance of it, I would say it was Park Si-woo's victory over Kana Asakura. Now, the way this tournament was made was there was a clear A side and B side. And those 4 stars I mentioned before, Asakura, Reina, Izawa, and Hamasaki, they were the 4 that were at the press conference revealing this tournament. And they're the 4 that are very much attached to the RIZIN brand. Now, Park has fought in RIZIN before, and she notably beat Reina in a RIZIN fight before. But we didn't really associate her with the RIZIN brand yet. She's very much a Deep Jewels fighter, and people who just watch RIZIN honestly wouldn't know too much about her. So she was definitely one of those B-side fighters heading into this tournament. But this performance against Asakura was a really strong one, and a really dominant one that did another great thing for building up her as a fighter in the promotion. So She was out of the four people in this tournament who you could consider a B side in a matchup. She was the one person who prevailed, and she beat Asakura. And you can do this storytelling going forward. We don't really know how this tournament will play out, but you can do the storytelling going forward that Park just dethroned the person who won in RIZIN's 2017 RIZIN Super Atomweight Grand Prix. Is this a passing of the torch of sorts that she beat Asakura and is now going on in the tournament? You can do this type of storytelling with it, even though Park is heading into this round absolutely still that dark horse that you don't really know how far she can get in it. I was talking before, last week I had Jason Aguilar on the podcast. I spoke to CJ about this, and he's also said the same thing on the We Are RIZIN podcast before, that Park really is this interesting person in the tournament, because many of us thought she would be the person to pull off that, if you want to call it an upset, victory early in the bracket and score a win, and that's exactly what happened. And it's worth noting this wasn't a close fight. This was quite a dominant performance from Park. My brain's kind of scrambled because I watched this event live and it went to 8 a.m. and then I went to sleep and I woke up before. And sometimes when I sleep after a RIZIN event, the first thing I do after I wake up is I have to read the results again and like rehash my memory, because something about being up all night watching it and then sleeping immediately after makes me lose focus about so much of it. But one thing I do remember was that Park's victory was a dominant one. And now she has two big wins in RIZIN against two of the more veteran names in the promotion in Asakura and Reina. So that's really interesting. Two other matches of note in the tournament. Ayaka Hamasaki beat Jessica Aguilar. This was an interesting matchup on paper because these two have a bit of a background together. I think I mentioned it on the podcast before that in 2011 they were scheduled to fight on a Jewels card, but then that a natural disaster in Japan actually stopped that fight from happening and canceled that entire card altogether, and we never got to see that fight happen. CJ of I'm still getting used to this solo thing where I'm just talking the entire 40 minutes. CJ of sogo-kaku.com wrote a really great article about it just over a week ago, and I recommend checking that out. But there certainly is a history between these two. Hamasaki pulled out the decision win in the co-main event of the card, beating Aguilar. Aguilar has yet to win since the end of her UFC run. So she's taken a couple losses now, and this was her return in a sense because her previous fight was on an XFC card back in 2020. So there was a bit of a layoff there when you compare it to someone like Hamasaki, who has already fought this year and has been fighting frequently throughout the pandemic. And the fourth tournament fight was Reina returning to super atomweight, facing Ukrainian newcomer Anastasia Savetkivska. Savetkivska, like Fontour, was someone coming in with a lot of unknowns. We'd never seen her fight in RIZIN before. She had never fought in the Japanese MMA scene before, so there was lots of questions going in. And the big story, in my opinion, for this fight was not the fight itself, but going into the fight, the return of Reina to the super atomweight class. This was her first appearance making the 108-pound limit since 2018. She tried making the limit in 2018 once and was hospitalized with a bad weight cut, and had since then fought around 110, 112, these weird catch weight, non-division type weight classes. So this was her return to 108. She made weight, no issue there, and had this fight against Anastasia, and this was a surprisingly close fight. Reina had a moment early on where she was able to hurt Savetkivska and almost finish the fight. She scored two knockdowns in a row. First one was due to punches, and then she followed up with a really well-timed kick to the head for another knockdown. I thought this fight was going to end here. The knockdowns looked really bad, and Reina was really pouring it on with these really powerful shots. But it kept going. Savetkivska survived and continued to look okay in the match after. And what's interesting is Reina had this really great moment in the first round, but after that, the second and third round, they were really competitive rounds, and going to decision, I actually didn't know who was going to win this. I tweeted something after the fight had ended and we had just not heard the result yet, and I was like, oh, this isn't looking good for Reina. And I ended up being wrong because in my mind, I was thinking it could go either way. It ended up going to Reina, but part of me was thinking she might have lost it due to what happened in the second and third rounds. I would imagine that it had to be that moment in the first round that did her so much in this match. You have to think about how RIZIN scores things and they score fights overall, that work in the first round undoubtedly exceeded anything that Anastasia did in the second and third rounds. And you'd have to think that that moment alone was what earned her the victory. Not alone, but that did a lot of the heavy lifting in that decision. So we have this interesting thing going into the next round of the tournament where there are these 4 fighters in the bracket, and there's only really 2 ways you can do these matchups, and one's interesting, but I don't really know if they would want to do it this way. So let me just break this down for you. We know that Izawa and Hamasaki have fought each other twice before, and Izawa won in both instances. And Izawa took the title from Hamasaki in that second encounter, and those 2 fights were quite recently. So would they want to do that matchup in the second round? I don't think so. And on the other end of the bracket, if they were to do that matchup, it would be Park versus Reina again, and on New Year's Eve, that's when Park beat Reina. So we have these 2 interesting matchups, but it just doesn't feel like it's the time for Izawa versus Hamasaki again. In my opinion, I think if there's any time they would want to do that fight, they would probably want to save it for New Year's Eve. So they're going to match these 2 women on the opposite side of the bracket for the semifinals. So then we would be having, I guess it would be Hamasaki versus Park, and it'd be Reina versus Izawa. And that would be 2 interesting matchups. I think that, that would be a really big challenge for Park. This is actually the first time I've thought about these matchups in a hypothetical sense. I do think that would be really interesting. It would be a huge challenge for Park, and for Reina, I mean, people don't really know what's next for after this tournament. Maybe that would be like the send-off for Reina if Izawa were to beat her in the second round. But if I had to predict which way they would go, I think they wouldn't do the trilogy and the rematch in the semifinals, but instead they're going to make these 2 new matchups in the semifinals, and then whatever comes out of that is what they're going to do in the finals. One thing that's worth noting, and I don't know if many people know this, but I think the plan, at least I'm fairly confident the plan is that the semifinals and the finals for this tournament will not be in the same night. They did that with the bantamweight bracket last year, where the semifinals and the finals were both on New Year's Eve. I don't think that's the plan with this one. I think that we are going to see the semifinals at an event before December, and then the finals will be in December. And it'll be interesting if that's how it goes. I don't really know why that is. Part of me thinks that maybe Kai Asakura getting injured in the Bantamweight Grand Prix last year during that 2 fights in one night sequence is what caused them to maybe go, okay, we're not gonna do that this time. But also at the same time, I mean, one night tournaments aren't this new thing that they're testing out. I mean, this is something that's been done for decades now. So it surprises me that they would just be deciding to suddenly change it because of this. I don't really get it, but personally, opinion wise on this, I don't really care. Like, some people really like the 2 final rounds on that one night. I know there's a lot of supporters for that, so I am going to mention that that theme does get a lot of support. But between that or just separating it through different cards, I personally don't mind. I think that if there's one thing that does cause an advantage for spreading out the tournament, is that it allows you to sell these singular fights more and do storytelling, because when you go into New Year's Eve and you still have these semifinal fights to do, you can't really promote what that grand final matchup could be, and you can't promote the possible storyline between those 2 fighters, because you won't know what that fight will be until just hours before it's set to happen, just after those semifinal fights happen. So I don't, I think if there's one thing that gives it a better promotional sense, it might be that. But also you could play devil's advocate and say that the spectacle of 2 fights in one night, of having to compete twice within a window of hours, that you could sell that to viewers as well. I don't know how effective that would be sold to viewers. I guess it is effective if so many people are big fans of the idea of doing 2 tournament rounds in one night. But anyway, that was the Super Atomweight Grand Prix. That was just a few of the many fights on this card. This is a very long show. I think it was 14 fights in total. It was supposed to be more, but then we lost some. Kota Miura was scheduled to fight. He's an incredibly famous prospect that is the son of a football player. He had, or at least someone in his party had COVID, and that caused his fight to get canceled. Other notable things from this event, opening fight was Yushi. Yushi's this interesting rise in talent where, he's not really an amazing fighter. He's only 2-1 now. He notably he made his debut on New Year's Eve, losing to Kota Miura that we just mentioned. And he's not that great of a fighter, and that's not an insult to him. I just think that he's not like world-class talent, but that's not why he's here. That's not what brings him to the show. He's this super charismatic, sort of like raver personality. I think that if there's anything that's most entertaining about his fight, it's his walkout. He has this very grand walkout, and he had dancers with him, and he had these, he had his big jacket and these cool shades on, and he started, fist pumping to techno music. It was this really hilarious but also cool thing that was happening. I was a fan of it. I tried to stay neutral, and I tried to say, oh, this, that. I'm not a fan of these things. I don't dislike these things. But I just think that Yushi's charisma, it's something you can't hate, really. So he won his fight against Haruki, scored a second round rear naked choke, and we'll probably see him again. Oh, I wanted to mention, just a testament to his charisma. He scored a knockdown in the first round of his fight, and after the round ended, you would think they would immediately run to replays of showing this knockdown. I mean, he dropped his opponent. That's why people tune into the sport, right? But before they got to that, they quickly showed another replay of his entrance in between rounds before they showed a replay of that knockdown. Other notable, honorable mentions on this card. One championship alum, Yoshiki Nakahara, picked up a win. It wasn't that entertaining of a win, but he did get one, and he beat Tetsuya Seki, who I think, off the top of my head, was a short notice opponent for him. He was originally scheduled to face Alka Sasaki. Very big honorable mention to Tsuyoshi Sudario, the notorious former sumo player turned MMA fighter. I almost owe him an apology, honestly. Last week on the pod, Jason Aguiar, I thought this matchup against Hideki Shrek Sakine, this is not a good match for him. Sakine, he's incredibly experienced. He's on a roll right now. He's beat all these names. And Sudario, he hasn't really beat anyone good. His only big win was against Minowa Man, and unfortunately he's very past his prime, so that wasn't really a big win. And Sudario's only loss was against Shoma Shibisai, someone who has lost to Sakine since then. So I was like, oh my god, they're throwing him to the wolves. He's gonna get slaughtered here, and this is gonna be the end of the career for the sumo wrestler. If there's one thing I said before that I do stand behind still, it's that this was a do or die fight for him. That for Sudario, this was the fight where if he lost it, there really is nothing left for him. He absolutely crushed Sakine. He finished him in 53 seconds. I'm looking at Tapology right now. It was a 53-second finish win, and he looked quite good in there. So I do have to sort of issue an apology almost, because I counted him out way too much. And I guess that, if you're going to try to be a pundit with a podcast, that's your whole job, is to call your shots and then try to be right with as many as possible. But I really was wrong with this one, so I'm going to own up to that. The thing is that's kind of weird is that I said I don't know what's next for Sudario after if he loses this. I don't really know what's next for him if he wins either. I guess they'll have to bring someone in, because when you look at the Japanese heavyweight scene, it really was just Shrek that he could have faced. So I don't know what they're going to do with him. I would presume they're going to do more with him, because this was a big performance and he's been around for a while now. He's likely not going anywhere. I'm interested, what made him improve so much. I know that he went to the US and trained with a lot of big names there. I guess that would probably be it, that he just spent a lot of time training, and he looked different in this fight. He looked way more refined and like more of a MMA fighter. He certainly looked incredibly green when he debuted in 2020, and now he's come a long way. So I don't know what RIZIN intends to do with him as a heavyweight. They don't really have a heavyweight division right now. And I don't necessarily know if they have the intention of building a heavyweight division currently. I mean, the big focuses right now are obviously super atomweight with this tournament, featherweight they're building, and you can also tell that they have interest in flyweight, especially with someone like Takaki Soya making his return and scoring a big finish. So yeah, that was honestly one of the biggest things to mention outside of the Grand Prix is that win. Another honorable mention goes to Daichi Abe, who spoiled the return of Marcus Yoshio Souza, scoring a very brutal right straight knockdown against him in the second round, and then following up with a bit of a grazing soccer kick. I don't think he completely landed it, but now that's 2 losses for Souza in RIZIN, have both been very brutal. He picked up a win in 2020. It was 2020. So he's 1 for 3 in RIZIN now. I don't know what's next for him, but he's Souza I'm talking about here. He's someone who clearly has that grappling experience, but just really struggles on the feet and has cardio issues. I mean, come the second round in this fight, he was really struggling, and someone like Abe, who has that experience as a UFC fighter, as a 1 championship fighter, as a Pancrase champion, and just picked him apart and scored that finish win. So he gets the honorable mention on this card. So really, I ran through the breakdown of this card quite quickly, and I think part of it is because this wasn't that amazing of a card after it happened. I mean, I spoke in recent weeks with CJ, and I spoke with Christopher Aguiar, and the question with both of them was, is this card Saitama worthy? And the answer they both gave me, and the answer that I agreed with, was on paper, heading into this card, this was a Saitama worthy card with that tournament, with all the other fights on it, all that. And it was a quality enough show to be at the venue, and it felt like one of the better cards we've seen this year. I still stand by the fact that April show, I think it was RIZIN 35, is probably going to be the best show of the year, if not to be topped by the New Year's Eve show. But this didn't play out the same way as you would see it on paper. There was so many decisions. There was a lot of really dragged out fights where there was a lot of stalemate positions and not a lot of notable moments. And these things aren't really things you can criticize a promoter or a fighter for, because it's a sport, and at the end of the day, these guys are just focused on winning. But it is something that you can make note of, that this show had a lot of really slow moments, and it was a long show too. It started at 1 a.m. and I think it finished around 8:15 a.m. over here on Eastern time zone. I'm in Toronto, if you didn't know. And selfishly, I have to say that when you're watching a show live like that and it gets that late into the morning, you're just like, oh, let's get this over with. I got to get out of here. I got to get sleep. I got to do other things. There are other people in my house who went to bed before the show started, and they woke up while the show was still going. And I bet to them, I just look like the biggest weirdo in the house, that I was just spending my entire night and morning covering a fight. But it's the risk you run with these shows, that not all of them can be great, not all of them can live up to what people expect when they see it on paper. But I would say that this show was not that great when you talk about replay value and stuff like that. It's interesting. We don't really know. Well, we have a rough idea of what's next for RIZIN in the schedule, but when it comes to what's like next, it's hard to tell. So it was revealed at the event this weekend that RIZIN 38 is going to take place on, I have the date here, on September 25th. And that's going to be the event that has the exhibition, presumably boxing match between Mikuru Asakura and Floyd Mayweather. This was a previously announced exhibition. Floyd Mayweather's second appearance in RIZIN. He previously came in 2018 and slaughtered Tenshin Nasukawa within a round in a boxing match. So that's going to be at RIZIN 38 on September 25th at Saitama Super Arena. I noted in my newsletter today that, yes, you read that right. The next RIZIN numbered event is 2 months from now. So, we have a bit of a waiting time for this next big show. I would presume that's the card where the semifinal fights for the Super Atomweight Grand Prix take place. Either that, or if they're going to do a show in October, that's probably where they would take place as well. But yeah, that is a bit of a wait. I'm really curious to know what is next with the RIZIN smaller offshoot sort of shows. We have the Landmark series, we have the Trigger series. The Landmark series is like a 4 or 5 fight show, and Trigger is like 11 fights, but it's much lower quality fights, and it's a quicker show. It runs by much quicker. I'm curious what's with those shows. I mean, are we going to see one next month? Are we going to see one ever again? I mean, I'm just they just seem so out of the picture recently because we haven't seen any of those for a while. And this month we did have 2 back-to-back numbered shows. So I'm curious if we're going to get something in that time, or because 2 months is a bit of a wait, and there's not necessarily anything important like the match or the Tokyo Olympics that are would cause them to step aside or anything like that. As far as I know, at least, there's no big event causing them to step aside. And also, I'm concerned for the site, right? Like, what am I going to cover for 2 months? No, I'm just kidding. We'll find stuff to do. I'm still surprised that the Asakura Mayweather thing is happening. I'm not like super surprised. If there was anyone in RIZIN that they would give this Mayweather fight to, it's Asakura, because he's just this like amazingly popular person right now. It's quite unbelievable how popular he is, not as a fighter but as an entertainer, really. I mean, his brand online, if you just look at his YouTube and all stuff like that, it's quite through the roof how much clout he has. I mean, I talked about this 2 weeks ago on the podcast. It's hard to believe how big of a name he is. So we're going to see that. And like I said, I'm predicting that that's when we're going to see the continuation of the Grand Prix. I want to talk about the broadcast for this event. It was really interesting this weekend. That people had trouble sort of reaching the show. I mentioned this in my newsletter today, but I throughout the week received numerous messages on Twitter, numerous DMs from people who were asking me, hey, do you know how to watch this show? And for most of the week, I didn't really have an answer. I was trying to figure out what the most friendly platform was for people to watch this show on. The previous event, I think, if I remember correctly, it was that RIZIN 36 was exclusive to their Stream Pass service, but that Stream Pass service hasn't launched for international viewers yet. And then for this event, they had Stream Pass still running, but they also had other stuff like numerous smaller platform pay-per-view carriers, including their RIZIN Live platform, which they launched back in 2020. So I told people that RIZIN Live was the system where I think that it was the easiest to purchase the show. But even then, I did receive some messages that some people had trouble getting their credit card to go through, and I read some other message about someone like getting a call from their bank or something about it. I don't know, it's weird. And the English commentary is still gone for now. There was stuff on Twitter from the commentators, Damian Brown and Joe Ferraro, about the event, and I think it confused some people because they were talking about how they were doing commentary for the event. They both posted stuff about how they're excited to commentate it and stuff like that, but their commentary wasn't actually available anywhere live. It was presumably recorded and will probably get posted as like a video on demand on Stream Pass or something like that in the future. I never asked, so I don't know. And then yeah, the only way you could hear their commentary last night was through like Twitter clips that were posted on the RIZIN English feed. So that did confuse some people. There was so much confusion overall about the broadcast this week. If the next event truly is all the way in September, you would hope that by then the confusion around stuff like that will be cleared up a little. We might have a real broadcast with English commentary and all that. We'll see though. I mean, it's so hard to tell. But I'll try to follow that once we get closer to the next event. And like I said, I don't know if that's the next event. I don't know if something's gonna happen in August. I don't know if nothing's gonna happen in August. But yeah, I guess that's most of what I wanted to cover on this episode. Next week we will have a guest on. I will mention more details about that in the coming weeks. But for this episode, I just wanted to provide a brief little rundown of the card, some thoughts. We do have a column out today as well that I wrote that had some quick bullet points about the show, a few smaller things that I didn't tackle in this podcast. If you want to read more about the show, read some more takes. I don't know if they're hot takes, but read some more takes. So head over to knockdownnews.com to read about that. You can follow me on Twitter at JackWannen, JackWannen. Look at me, I'm getting plugs in because I have no guests. I mean, this is usually the part where the guest gets their plugs in. This week it's my turn. And follow the website on Twitter at Knockdown News. I mean, we do a lot of JMMA stuff. That's sort of the niche that we try to corner to give people some more stuff from that scene. But we also cover a lot of things. I mean, there's the UFC fight night on this weekend. There is a PFL show on Friday too that I don't know if I'm gonna be able to cover it because of scheduling and life and stuff, but I will have a preview out and stuff like that. So we'll be watching those shows closely this weekend and covering them and providing you all the great journalism and coverage that you hopefully want. All right, so that's all. I'm gonna head out of here and finish up my preparation for this week's JMMA Monday, and I hope to see you back next week on this podcast when we have a guest and we will talk more about the latest developments in the JMMA scene.